Okay, I put this up there just as a very brief review. You'll remember we start out with the axial age theory, and Carl Jaspers is the one who coined the term. And the image showing the ebb and flow of civilizations once civilizations, what we call civilizations, have started with the drawing of borders and a hierarchical power structure. Then just again, continuing the review of the metaphor of the spear and the point of the spear. Today, one of the big concerns, of course, is COVID-19 and tracing that all the way back. And we've pretty well covered creation of borders, national states, and disconnect from nature, anthropocentric mindset, and the rise of abstract ideologies. Once you disconnect from the natural world, it leaves a vacancy, which then begins to get filled with these different ideologies, which are designed to deal with cultures which are now formalized into a hierarchy and border kind of organizations. Today, we're going to go into a little more detail on objectification and masculine domination, institutionalization. We're also going to kind of address a little bit tool use and environmental separation and the rise of more aggressive societies. And so this next hour plus, hour and a half, that's kind of the topics we'll be looking at. I can't. Okay. So starting with what is the relationship between masculine domination and objectification? The rise of object focus, masculine domination, when you get that, we've kind of tried to address this, what happens then is the feminine side of who I am personally as a male is not encouraged. When I was growing up, I don't even know that it was conscious, but when I was growing up, that side of me was probably indirectly in many different little messages I got as a little boy growing up and going into high school, and especially high school and so on. Almost unconsciously, I was discouraged from the feminine side of who I am. You've got to be a man, a real man, such types of terminology, which was really squelching a piece of who I was as a human being. And of course, the city is our hometown, or I don't know how many of you are originally from Kansas City, but this is our downtown area. And throughout my educational process, I was given the impression that time equals progress. And indirectly, it became apparent that progress was about evolving tool use. The better tools we have, the better humans we become. And some of these messages are very subtle, some of them are more direct. So I've got, of course, the pyramid, the Egyptian pyramid, which was the pyramid of Cheops, or Cheops is the Greek name. The Greeks named a lot of these ancient Egyptians. As a matter of fact, the word Egypt is Greek. Kemet is the real word that they use for themselves, Kemet. And the pyramid This is in the Egyptian, the word for Cheops is Khufu, which is the largest of the Egyptian pyramids. But it's quite a magnificent creation. And at the bottom is a sphinx. And there was some notion that Napoleon shot a cannon at the Sphinx, but some people are trying to discount that at this point, whether that's really true or not. But on the left-hand side, you see at the very top a flintlock rifle. And just before the flintlocks, you had another mechanism known as a matchlock. The problem with matchlocks is that when you shot them, the bullet, you could not predict. It might just fly anywhere. And once it left the end of the gun, that bullet was just free to go almost anywhere it decided to go. And the flintlock was a little more of an improvement over the matchlock in that you had a little more control of that. So we go on down to the AK-47s at the bottom. What's interesting about that is that the Second Amendment was composed when we had flintlocks. So in that context, the people who thought about the Second Amendment, you have to wonder, well, were they thinking someday there'll be an AK-47 you can carry around on the streets and that kind of thing. But then over on the right-hand side is a modern train. It looks more European than US. And then when I was in high school, I went to North Kansas City, and then I transferred over to Westport High School in Midtown, KC. But these automobiles in 1957 were all the rage. And my fellow students were thinking, this is the ultimate of automobile designs. Cars will never improve beyond this design. We have reached the top. And they love these sweeping wheels, these gas guzzling, vehicles and so on. And these fins sweeping out and things like that. And of course, never did we dream that that would be modified. But of course, we're 17 years old. So that's our way of thinking. But time equals progress. And then I'll put a question mark after. Is it really progress or is it just change? It feels like there's a bias, a cultural bias when we use the word progress. Then carrying on with tools, we have tools of expansion. In the lower left-hand corner, Egyptian chariots. And then in the upper right-hand side, the rise of the medieval, and this happens to be early Renaissance armor. There, European armor used, tools of expansion. Then on the left, we have U.S. military, and then what used to be considered the ultimate airplane, bomber. And I'm having, no, it's called the stealth bomber. Right, thank you. And by the way, all the stealth bombers in the U.S. Air Force are stationed at Whiteman Air Force Base, Knob Noster, Missouri. So that's where all the stealth bombers in the arsenal are located, which I think is just kind of an interesting sidelight. And I understand now there's another bomber that's been improved over it. I don't know how wide use it is at this point in time. But this is an extremely fast machine and a very dangerous, and it's designed so radar can't pick it up. So tools of expansion. Again, I'll ask, is this advancement? or has it just simply changed? And I think to look at that question a little more seriously, if you only narrow the view into a linear improvement of our equipment, military equipment, it appears to be advancement. But if you contextualize it and you put it into the broad scheme of our society, then you begin to say, well, I'm not sure. It is certainly change, and it's change in our military strategy and that kind of thing. And to continue that line of thought, when I was growing up, I moved into Westport Arms, which is a 10-story apartment building, when I was 6 years old. And my mother and stepfather did not move out of there until I was a sophomore in college. And on the upper left hand, you see what I call the black daffodil foam, because it kind of looks a little like a distorted daffodil flower, right? Or maybe it's my strange imagination in operation. But that's what we had in our little apartment. And if you wanted to call, notice there's no dial on it. You can't dial a number or anything. You'd pick up the ear and hold the receiver, and I would call down to Miss Agee downstairs in the lobby on the switchboard, and I'd give her the number, and she'd plug me in and dial the number. And I may be dating myself. I may be the oldest person here. I don't know. But that's what we had as a telephone. And today, on the left-hand side, is what I carry on my pocket, or the right hand over there. You see the thin that replaced the black daffodil there. I now have one in my pocket, which does more than the black daffodil did. But it's still a phone, basically. Underneath that, I put time equals progress, and I put a question mark under it. But let's move across the top first. In that circle, in kind of a dimmed out picture, you see a native storyteller. They're sitting next to each other, and the storyteller is talking. And in native culture, many times the listeners would shut their eyes as the storyteller was weaving the story and going through. Their own minds would create the image. And you're sitting next to each other, oftentimes in a circle. And maybe it's a forested area where the native housing would be around in the clearing area. And you'd have the forest with the sounds of the forest, maybe sun setting, and the birds, and you hear the birds and the storytellers talking. Maybe your eyes are closed, maybe they're not, but your brain is creating these images. And it has this natural function of creating images. But when I was growing up, there was no such thing as a television. Now, undoubtedly, there were people inventing the television, but it did not exist out in the public. But what we did have was this big console. Some of you may remember these big radios. And so we would have 30-minute programs of, the stories and things like that on the radio. And so your brain is doing the same thing as it was doing in the center picture with the storyteller. The problem is the storyteller has now been replaced by a machine. So I still remember one of the mysteries that I tune into and listen to a mystery, and you would hear this sound coming out. The shadow knows. I don't know if any of you remember that or not. And my mind is exploding in images at that point. And then you might hear steps walking down a sidewalk. So your mind is creating the sidewalk and the image, and two people, you're hearing two step prints or sounds of people walking on a sidewalk, and they get together and they meet. And the one guy introduces himself, the woman says, hello. And the other guy, the man says, hello, I'm Digger Dell, the friendly undertaker. And, I wonder how many of you remember this. Anyway, my mind has created Digger Odell, what he looks like. And my mind, based on the woman's voice, has created an image of what she looks like on the sidewalk and the streets around. Of course, the streets are going to look something like what I was growing up with. Beginning when I was 6 years old, moving into that building. And I was, the building was on the corner of Armour and Central, which is also at Armour and Broadway. And some of you may be familiar with the Kansas City Life Insurance Building. And there's a lot of tall apartment buildings in that neighborhood. So can you imagine what a 7, 8, 9-year-old kid is going to choose to play on with 8 and 10-story apartment buildings? Guess what? We all figured out how to get on those rooftops. And so rooftops were just a favorite to be way up there above the traffic and so on. I won't go into some of the mischief we created because I don't want to expose my that side of my personality, but we did create a bit of mischief here and there. But anyway, just reminiscing a little bit. On the lower left-hand side, the Gutenberg press was invented in the 1440s. And I'll get back to that later in further slides on down. And now we have the printed book, which is kind of does the same thing as the handheld cell phone that we now have today. When I'm in a doctor's office, for example, I'll be sitting there, maybe there are 12 people in the doctor's office. 11 out of the 12 people are holding these phones, staring into the screen. They may be sitting next to each other, but they're really not aware. I'm making a point, because of my age, to not get my cell phone out. I'm just watching people. And it's interesting to watch the change of behavior over the last 20, 30 years, because I can still recall what it used to be like in a doctor's office or any other time that we were together. But the change of behavior that has happened. And moving on over to the television that you see, loss of imagination. Because recounting back to the days with that big console radio and Digger Odell, the friendly undertaker, I no longer create these images. It's all done for me now, basically. And then if you get on the computer system, the key on using computer for information is discernment, because there's so much on there.
Gil, you've muted yourself. We can't hear you.
You missed it, touch that.
There you go. We didn't hear anything after you said you have to use discernment on the computer.
Yeah, that was my main point. There's so much information out there now coming through the computerization and so on. It's really now, I think it's a good mental exercise, however, to try to use some discernment. And to me, the challenge is to contextualize the information, because most information should fit evenly into a context. And if it doesn't, then that kind of raises a little questioning there. But it's offered some challenges here. So then coming to borders, the rise of borders tend to create more aggressive societies. Because there's kind of a shift then that begins to happen, them and us. And it's very important to think in terms of relativity here, because it's a matter of not whether either or, it's a matter of how intense it is. What is the level of intensity? Any community will have a sense of them and us. But what borders do is intensify that sense, so that oftentimes the other starts becoming demonized in a sense. So the rise of more aggressive societies with objectification of the other. This is a tough picture in many respects. On the left-hand side, you have the British Army. They are a state, nation-state form of socio-political system. And they are the aggressor. And in order to be the aggressor, they had to demonize the people on the right. So in other words, they have to create an illusion about who these people really are. And the people on the left, though, are what we oftentimes study in our history as the civilized people. And the demonization of the other on the right-hand side are the barbarians, in order to demonize, or the savages, or whatever. But the fact is, the people on the right-hand side are not a border-based people. They are a lineage-based people. In other words, the lineage-based people is a family, an organizational structure that's based on deep, extended family and ancestral ties. That's the basis for their socio-political system. So what you have here, and by definition, that's tribalism. By definition, that's tribalism, which one of my pet peeves, I'll probably address it again somewhere in here, is when these newscasters, when they're defining people that are fighting and not getting along, they call it tribalism. And at that point, I begin to blow up at the TV, you know, because that's racist. Everybody in America knows that American Indians are tribal people. But by definition, tribal is a lineage-based culture. So what you have here is really these two extremes in human socio-political development facing off here. And the English, as Carol Quigley was talking about in earlier classes, they're a society of expansion. And the people on the right-hand side are trying to defend their territories against that expansion. But yeah, their homeland, the people on the right, that's their homeland. So, again, this is now New York City, Long Island. So what we find once borders are drawn and we begin to get this structure, socio-political structure, we begin to shift from a more relationship-oriented people, process-oriented, to an object-oriented people. So I have a handshake there and the objectification of Manhattan Island there with the skyscrapers and so on. So this began, this idea of interfacing with a relationship process orientation and an object orientation. That interface, which is here, you see it here in action on that previous slide, that interface began in the colonial period. And one example, there's an example that's really great here, is under Governor Berkeley of the Virginia colony, sent a delegation to negotiate with the Mohawk people. And so there was a meeting place. I can't remember the details of the meeting place, but in Eastern Indian negotiations, the native peoples insisted on a 9-day process. 6 of the 9 days dealt with building a relationship between the two parties. They didn't even talk about the issue at all, because it was all about creating this relationship. That left only 3 days to actually negotiate. So they wanted to build a relationship between the two parties before they even began to get to the topic itself. Well, of course, this is extremely frustrating to the English. And, but they had no choice at that point in time in history because they had to use native protocols at that point. But during the process, there's a gift exchange that always happens. And the gift exchange is a major part of building the relationship before the negotiations actually start. So during one of those 6 days, one of the people, negotiators from the Virginia colony, brought in the gifts and just kind of tossed them on the ground. And the person leading the Mohawk negotiation stopped the whole process immediately. And they went into a lengthy oratory that went on over a long time. He started out with the beginning of the relationship that the Mohawks had with the Virginians, the history of that relationship, and how they had always been able to work things out and work together here by these honest conversations, so on. And right towards the end of this lengthy oratory, he talked about the appropriate way of gift exchange. And then he ended it right there. Then he said, negotiations or the process is done for today, we'll start over tomorrow. And of course, again, a great frustration on the part of the British negotiators. But kind of a comparison as to object, what happens with this object orientation interfacing with a relationship, a process orientation of relationship. So moving on to objectification, masculine dominance. It took us until 1920 to pass the 19th Amendment, which was the women's right to vote in this country. And some of you may, if you study American history, may be familiar with Seneca Falls in 1848, when Lucretia Mott and Susan B. Anthony and the other woman, I'm sorry, led a women's suffrage, which started the movement of women's suffrage. And it wasn't until 62 years later when the 19th Amendment was passed. But before then, talking about masculine dominance, women could not own property or vote, had no right to their own wages, had no rights in divorce cases or to their children, no equal opportunity to employment, and very limited college access. So the picture here shows the headquarters, which is the issue now of women's suffrage. The issue of the 19th Amendment has come up. And this picture shows the headquarters National Association opposed to women's suffrage. And on the lower right-hand corner, you see a woman walking by, looking back at the men standing at that booth. And then on the lower left-hand picture, you see a picture of Lewis Henry Morgan. Lewis Henry Morgan, the father of anthropology, mid-19th century. Lewis Henry Morgan was actually an MD. And he was raised in the Finger Lakes area of New York State. Can't remember the town. I lived in Rochester, I think, towards his older years. He was close to the Seneca Reservation, and he was fascinated by the Senecas. And it's that fascination that led to the groundwork laid for the entire field of anthropology, the field of anthropology. So his writings are quite good, considering there's been no other anthropologist before him. There's one place that reflects an issue, however, in his writings. He could not understand Seneca women. He could not understand the fact that women in that culture had equal say to men. That utterly confused him. Because in his mind, civilized people, the men were dominant. So he figured that uncivilized people, women had more say. And so he tried to figure this confusion out and make sense of it. So he created the word barbarianism. Of course, the word already existed, but he applied it here in this case. And he rationalized that there were three stages of barbarianism: barbarian 1, 2, and 3. The most advanced stage of barbarianism was 3. And he said the Senecas must be at stage 3 because they seem to be well developed otherwise, except for this one flaw, that women had equal say. And so this is how this whole concept began to emerge. Further on objectification, dropping into another time period, San Antonio Mayor rips Texas Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick for saying old people should sacrifice themselves for the economy. Well, let's see. I'm 81, going on 82. Where do I go to do this? You know, that's of course not my thought. But I also think this picture is interesting because I notice on his sideburns there, he's beginning to gray. I'm wondering in 10 or 20 years from now if he'd have the same opinion, you know, but it's kind of interesting. Now we get into a sad moment, a recent one. The murder of Ahmaud Arbery, which has become quite, of course, controversial. The two men at the lower right at the bottom, 72 days after his murder, were arrested. Nothing was done about that until the FBI came in. Somebody had alerted them. And I think the Black community, who was deeply concerned about this, made sure it got out. But somehow it went 72 days. The man on the top filmed the murder and was part of the chase that trapped Ahmaud Arbery. What's interesting about that, he filmed it, and that day he gave the law officials the film. So they knew it that day that the murder happened, and the district attorney also found out about it. But nothing was done until 72 days afterwards. That's well over 2 months later. Today, Twin Cities, Minneapolis, St. Paul, probably demonstrations will be going on today and tonight to bring us up to current moments. But with this, what I'm watching, sometimes I skip into it in the evening, and they're going to cities like yesterday, they went to Hollywood, California, because my association with Hollywood, of course, are movies and things like that. The marches going on there, Washington, D.C., what happened day before yesterday in Washington, D.C., New York, a lot of on New York, Chicago, Seattle, all around the country. 2 days ago, I believe, on MSNBC, Ari Melbourne came to Kansas City and showed a massive groups of people in the just before you get into the plaza area and so on. What I liked about seeing that was that they filmed a big man and one of the police officers hugging each other. It was close to the Nichols fountain there on the plaza area, and discussing that. But all of this is recalled for me Martin Luther King Jr. and the peace movement of Martin Luther King, the struggle for racial equality in America. And it recalls a couple of his quotes. A riot is the language of the unheard. And another one, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. That was, yeah, that was, yeah, I think that was in the early 50s, 1950s and so on. Okay, 50 years. Okay, with only information, masculine objectification. So from the Miami Herald, I pulled this on April the 16th. When the Miami Herald sought information from the Miami-Dade County Medical Examiner's Office last month about COVID-19 deaths in the epicenter of Florida's coronavirus outbreak, attorneys for the state health department moved to block the records from becoming public. Governor Ron DeSantis often has been unwilling or unable, and at times has actively tried to shield critical details about the depths of the crisis from becoming public. So I'm classifying that as on the axial age as a masculine withholding information and objectification. And here, human creations cause both best and worst case scenarios. And showing this picture here of what's going on today, and talking about the creations that usually when we get something new introduced into our society, we think mostly in terms of, well, how will this benefit? But tool use also has other case scenarios that would balance out this. And the cell phone, I've already kind of mentioned that a little bit. It's a plus. I can carry it in my pocket, but I did not get a cell phone until my youngest son started to drive. And then I thought, well, maybe it would be a good idea for me to get a cell phone at that point. I kind of preferred the black daffodil over the pocket, carrying the cell phone. That's partly due to my age, probably, but it may be also due to wisdom, although I won't claim wisdom at all here. And then on the other hand, our rapid transportation, the fact that we've increased, like I can fly to Europe from the United States in 7 hours, not 3 months crossing on a ship or on the old, Spanish galleons and so on. And so I put an airplane up above on the left-hand side of the COVID-19 picture from Wuhan, China. It's spread now globally instead of being contained in that area. But I think it also goes further. There's a sense of objectification involved here. Since the news I'm getting is that COVID-19 is a virus that comes from bats. And in Wuhan and other places, they have what's known as wet markets and so on. So one theory is that the COVID came out of there. But Wuhan also has experimental laboratories, which are among the finest in the world. So then there's a theory came out of there. I haven't heard the latest. I don't know if there is any real knowledge of where it originated. But we do know now that it's worldwide. And so the two issues that are in here is trying to gain control of our environment. By one example would be the wet market, and I know this is controversial. Also, scientific experiments using environmental forces under our own control. Is this kind of an issue? Is our technology, which has allowed it to spread so rapidly globally, also an issue here? And I wanted to put something on a plus note here. Brings tears to my eyes when I see examples of our humanity and the responses to COVID-19 all over America, into Canada, for our first line workers, be them transportation people, people supplying our foods into the grocery stores, people working in the grocery stores, people like my son who works in the emergency room at a hospital here, who's exposed to COVID-19 when he goes to work. The lack of protective equipment for first care workers. But look at this. When they show pictures of New York City, and I see the thousands and thousands of people from balconies and everywhere cheering these workers. And of course, it's become personal for me because of my son. But to me, it's so moving. And I see examples of our humanity that we have. In spite of all the negativity and the hard stuff that we face in our news every day, we're still human. We still have this sense of humanity about us. And on that positive note, I'd like to pause and see if there's comments or discussion or questions or anything that people might like to bring up.
Remember that you can unmute yourself. If you have trouble, put in the chat box that you need help and I will help you unmute.
Gil?
Yes.
Yeah, it's Alan. Earlier on in your class today, you mentioned that our orientation towards time, the modern orientation towards time, has led to progress because of evolving tool use. And that made me think that in looking at the development of technology, inventions in the world, that while an awful lot of stuff came out of China before it, as is well known, before it spread to the rest of the world, that one of the few late medieval inventions to come out of Europe was the clock, the spring-loaded clock.
Right.
And it was, I think, C. Northcote Parkinson of Parkinson's Law fame, who brought this to my attention in his book, East and West, about why the West Europeans triumphed militarily and in some ways early on culturally over Southeast Asians. He didn't get into the Western Hemisphere at all. He was interested in Southeast Asia, and he said it was significant that the Europeans had a concern with precision as measured by time that the Malays, the Indians, Asian Indians, did not have, and that this was really significant.
Yeah. Right. I think that's a good point. That sense of time. So it reminded me when I was teaching, I had to be in the building at 7 a.m. And my first class was 7:20. And I had to time it. I had to do everything. You know, the minute I woke up, the alarm went off. And at that point, I'm in a time zone. And everything I did to get ready to go to work and so on, I had to be in time. And sometimes an administrator would be standing at the door watching the parking lot with his watch. So, and you're thinking, oh my God, I'm 2 minutes late. Yes. And I actually got a notification in my file one time that I was 2 minutes late. So, yeah. The time has to be a critical issue, precision of time, especially when we start looking at an the industrial revolution, industrial development, and then the issue of production and productivity and that type of thing, I think, begins to elevate it. But we also had the hourglasses, you know, to measure time and so on, is a more ancient form. So that's an interesting comment about that. What were you going to say? Any other comment or discussion? Okay, well, Lori, I think we can go on then.
Okay, Gil, go ahead.
Okay. Okay, we're going to move on into colonialism, the Axial Age, morphs into colonialism. And this picture is India. And over on the right-hand side, you see somebody who's acting kind of as a supervisor, and then over by him is an assistant and so on. So during that time, there's always been expansion. You know, Egypt, ancient Egypt was during their empire age, or what they call the New Kingdom, was expansive. The Alexander the Great, of course, moved all the way into India before he finally stopped. And in Egypt today, Alexander the Great being Greek, in Egypt today, you have the city of Alexandria, named after Alexander the Great, and so on. And so you have this, once the nation state's formed, it almost becomes an institution within itself of expansion. Now, what expansion looks like can differ. It can be a physical occupation of other territories, or in this day and age, with the advent of more technology, more sophisticated technology, the instrument expansion can be non-occupational as far as a physical occupation, or it may have elements of occupation, like being a limited number of troops in Afghanistan would be an example of that, with along with the North Atlantic Treaty Organization also has troops in Afghanistan. But the limit, it doesn't have to have a complete occupation today, largely because of two forces, I believe, that come in here to play. One is the technology, and the other is economic leverages that can be used. But in the earlier ages of the expansion, there has to be almost a physical occupation control. So we start out here with Africa, and of course on the Axial Age, on the shaft of the spear, we have objectification, material gain, and slavery. Just some pictures here. On the lower left-hand corner is a book by Willie Lynch. It's a letter by, and it says Making of a Slave. The Lynch family was a slave owning, they had a plantation in the Bahamas. And they were especially noted for their slaves and how they controlled them. And so this is the letters encompassed in this book explain in detail all the techniques of slave control. And one of the techniques was lynching. So you would force your slaves to watch lynchings, whether the person being lynched had violated one of their rules or whatever it may have been, or maybe not. The idea was to intimidate the rest of them. And hence, today, that's where we got the word lynch, from the last name of this family that had slaves in the Bahamas. So I just have pictures like slaves being transported over, you see over here in the right-hand part of the thing, slaves being transported over. Anybody who was sick or died were not profitable, so they would just throw him overboard. The picture of the slave there next to the boat has been beaten, and you can see the scars on his back and so on. And I'm especially fond of this slide. When I was teaching in high school, at the end of the year, I would show the film Gandhi, and it would take me 3 days to show it in my Western civilization classes. And I wore a shirt today, you probably can't see it, but it's got written on it, almost anything you do will be insignificant, but it's very important that you do it. And that triggers a memory of mine, because Gandhi left India to go to college in, I believe he went to England. I forget if it was in London. I don't remember, I could look it up, I didn't. But he got his JD, a Juris Doctor there, and from there he went to South Africa to begin his idea of nonviolent civil disobedience. And I put 2 Sanskrit words over by his picture over here on the lower right-hand corner. Ahimsa in the ancient Sanskrit means, basically in English, it means do no harm. And that forms the very cultural basis for Mohandas K. Gandhi was his name. And the crowds, when he got to India and started the movement there, they started calling him Mahatma Gandhi, much to his shock, because his real name is Mohandas. But Mahatma in Sanskrit means great soul. So the crowds started shouting Mahatma, great soul. And it comes down in history as known as Mahatma, but it's not his real name. So ahimsa means do no harm. That's where you get somewhat in Hinduism, you get this concept. And in the Jain religion, the Jain religion in India carries this to a far degree of not even doing harm to insects or anything. But it's a fascinating concept, and it forms the basis of the Gandhian revolution against British occupation of India. And that gets embedded into the whole process of satyagraha. And satyagraha is really expands ahimsa, which is do no harm, into civil disobedience, this whole concept of nonviolent civil disobedience. And you begin to practice this in South Africa. Well, World War I starts. The British are engaged in World War I, which means India is getting drawn into World War I as well. So out of concern, Gandhi leaves South Africa and his Satyagraha movement in South Africa. He moves to India in 1914, at the beginning of World War I. And he begins his teachings, and he begins to develop a following in India during the war. But something shocking happened that moved Gandhi into a whole nother level. There was a massacre at Amritsar, where a crowd of people had gathered to listen to one of the people who was working with Gandhi, who was up giving a speech, a massive crowd, and a General Reginald Dyer, who was in charge of the British military there, decided this was dangerous, of British control of India. So he moved his troops into Amritsar, where the speech was being given with this large crowd of Indians, and ordered them to open fire. 400 were massacred in the Amritsar incident. And this spurred Gandhi into and much more active. It did not shake him from ahimsa and satyagraha. It did not shake him from that. But it moved Gandhi into a sense of urgency that we must start moving now. And of course, if you follow the Gandhian nonviolent civil disobedience movement, which has influenced the United States, but if you follow that, the British were actually forced to move. I have a dog that's barking because somebody's at the door. One of the delights for having an at-home class. But what it did, I think, was pick up the pace and the determination. This tells me something about the character of Gandhi. It didn't veer him off of his direction, but what it did was creating a sense of urgency. But the fact that he didn't leave the idea, the fact that he didn't leave the concept, the fact that his belief was so strong in the concept of do no harm, that he just simply responded by understanding a greater urgency in moving the British out of India. What's interesting is that the nonviolent approach finally worked in 1948. So Amritsar happened April 1919. So you see, also, when we're talking about major socio-political movements and changes, we're not talking about an overnight process. But we are talking about consistency, a very consistent approach. When you see a very definite need for change in your socio-political system or in your society, you cannot expect for it to change overnight. But if you stay consistent and you don't veer off from your basic philosophy and concept, you will win. And I think that's the teaching of Gandhi. And as you probably know, all of this influenced Martin Luther King. And also influences, I believe, maybe even what we're seeing in our cities each day today. This idea of protest peacefully and non-violently. But we're also seeing another phenomena that happened, and I think it also happened with the Gandhian movement too. Anytime you get a movement of change, you have the core philosophical process of the movement, but you always get an attachment of people with other agendas that will latch on to the movement and take advantage of it. That'll happen 100% of the time. And that's what we're seeing in our cities today. We have the core of the movement, and most of it during the day, of the thousands and thousands of people in the streets of our major cities. And at nighttime, it begins to shift into a different profile. And we see that. I was, for years, a part of a movement. I don't know if you know what happened at Big Mountain, Arizona, where there was an attempt to force relocate Navajo Indians in violation of the treaty agreements out of Big Mountain. And I got involved in that movement, and I saw that happen. There was also an infiltration of government agents in disguise, as if they were interested in the movement, but they were also secret agents that had infiltrated into it. So you have a very complex something that happens here. But I think what Gandhi teaches us here, that yes, that's going to happen. Those distractors will always be there, but you can't allow them to divert yourself from ahimsa and satyagraha. So if you have a very powerful concept, if you have a very powerful moral issue, you stay with it, you stay consistent, and eventually take the clock, as Alan was mentioning a while ago, the clock, and take the calendar and take that out of the picture, because you can't predict it. Just simply do what in your heart is the right thing. And in Gandhi's case, it was ahimsa and satyagraha. So I think it's a very powerful, and it really speaks to us today. Excuse me. I think it really speaks to us today. And you know, it is a positive way of seeing and approaching extreme negativity that, you know, in our lives we have to deal with. Australia is just a continuation of the colonial expansion. I don't know how many of you saw the movie, The Rabbit-Proof Fence. The same thing happened in the United States and in Canada, is that there were boarding schools. They were going in and taking children. I'll be blunt, they were stealing children from their parents, Indian children, and forcing them into these boarding schools. The last of the boarding schools stopped operating that way in the United States in the late 1960s. I taught with a woman who was Choctaw. I won't go in a lot of detail because of our time limitations, who was forced into these boarding schools and was taken away from her family and forced into these boarding schools. But this is about Australia, and if you saw The Rabbit-Proof Fence, these pictures came from that movie, and it shows here children being taken away. In the lower left-hand picture, or right-hand, I'm sorry, close to that spear point, you'll see a parent in that picture staring into the car window, the agony, and the little child staring back out. And you see in the child's face, you see the hand of the parent on the window there that's happening there. This is part of the process of assimilating indigenous people into the mainstream of the community. There was in about 1400 AD, there's a cardinal, Cardinal Pierre de Lay, a Catholic cardinal, who wrote a book, Imago Mundi. And it's a massive work, you know, because, you know, the cardinals in the Catholic Church were very literate, and they did a lot of work. This is before the printing press. the Gutenberg press. They did a lot of writing, copying, and things like that. Like Cardinal Pierre de Lay wrote this massive book called Imago Mundi. And he finished it in 1410. But what it is, the basic theme of the book is that the second coming of Christ cannot happen until everybody on earth was a Christian. The problem is, how are they going to get everybody on earth to be a Christian? So what he does, he goes back to all the early Greek philosophers and examines all of these early Greek philosophers and playwrights. If you'll remember, we talked about those earlier. You know, we talked about Pythagoras and Socrates, and we talked about the playwrights, Sophocles, Aristophanes, and he goes all the way back, includes what they're doing in his book. And then he moves into all the Roman historians, philosophers, and this. It's an incredible, massive work. It has only one intent. How do you circumnavigate the globe? And how big is the globe? And he's trying to gather all of these people because, you know, by the Greek times, they were pretty much aware the world was round. You know, maybe peasantries and people that didn't know that, but really, most of the educated people were fully aware of the world being round. Archimedes, and it goes on and on. So he's gathering all these estimates on how to do that. And then he finally gets back into his main theme. How do we circumnavigate the entire globe? How do we convert every human being on earth to Christianity, including all the savages, the primitives? How do we convert all these people? And then he also comes out with a stunning statement in Imago Mundi. As you spread throughout the world, Christianity, preparing for the second coming of Christ, you must determine if the savages can be converted. If they cannot be converted, you must kill them. Because until you do that, the second coming of Christ cannot happen. In the 1440s, the Gutenberg press came out, and eventually Imago Mundi was published. In 1480, and some of the authors vary, some say 1485, 1480, Cristobal Colon, aka Christopher Columbus, got his own copy of this book. There are 900 notations from Columbus in the margins of this book. So this was almost like a Bible to him. Another sidelight of my own kind of my brain, how it was operating. In 1961, I went to Madrid, Spain, and I saw this statue of Cristobal Colon. And I'm standing there looking at Cristobal Colon, and I'm saying, who in the world is Cristobal Colon? They seem to have this big image of him. Never heard of him. And of course, I always knew him as Christopher Columbus, which is his anglicized name. But can you imagine standing there wondering, who in the world is Cristobal Colon? Yeah, just a sidelight and a little comment on my own ignorance. So it is humbling to realize how limited my knowledge actually is. So coming over here, can you move the picture over on this side or something? We have what became known as the Columbian Exchange. Yeah, well, yeah, that's great. And I just put a very brief picture. As we all know, Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492. That stimulated what became known as the Columbian Exchange. And I don't have the book here, but I would recommend 1491 and 1493 by Charles Mann. It's two large volumes. 1491, it's all about the Columbian Exchange by Charles Mann. If I thought about it, I would have kind of put a picture of that in here. But Charles Mann is a journalist. But what's his advantage is that in writing this massive work, he consulted with all kinds of professionals, all the way from botanists to biologists, historians, anthropologists, psychologists. He consulted with some of the very academic names, scholarly names in the field to put this kind of massive work together. And but what we have is, once this happened, the American hemisphere had been isolated, and there are all kinds of theories and so on about how long. The most recent archaeological work is coming up with anywhere between 14 to 16,000 years ago that the hemisphere was becoming populated. And over that length of time, you have cultures that are very different. They had enough time to kind of evolve into something, very different kinds of cultures. And so they had come up with a lot of things that was found nowhere else in the world. And that becomes known historically as the Columbian Exchange, of course, after Cristobal Colon and his name and so on. And so I just put this up here. This is an incomplete map showing all the things that were exchanged. I just wanted to put that up there. And I just wanted to also mention a book by another scholar, James Axial. He got his degrees from Cambridge University and Yale University PhD. He is a professor of ethnohistory well, he was at Yale, Sarah Lawrence College on Long Island, and the College of William and Mary. I think that's where he currently is teaching. Reminded me, we have somebody in Spark who taught at William and Mary. David, I can't think of his last name. You know what? I'm saying I'm running out of time. Let me finish this one thing and then we'll stop for questions. One thing that James Axial is an ethnohistorian. An ethnohistorian is a fascinating field because they combine history, anthropology, linguistics, sociology, and so on, and try to make it into one unit of study. And it's kind of a fascinating concept when you think about it. So really, they're trying to understand the cultures of the people that history is addressing. And so his comment here, I also quoted, each culture must be understood on its own terms. And that's critical to ethnohistory. That's their whole point, is to try to figure that out. As these changes over time, ethnohistory ensures that the history of the frontier will cease to be a short, pathetic story of the inevitable triumph of a booming white civilization over a fragile primitive culture. His concept is that native peoples were not primitive, that they were actually highly developed, sophisticated cultures. And that's kind of his reason why I pulled that quote out of there. And by the way, this is only one book of many that he has published. I think the whole concept of ethnohistory is really a fascinating concept to try to approach it. It's a tough concept to deal with because it's a challenge. Because history approaches humanity from the past to the present. Anthropology does the reverse, from the present to the past. And of course, then you salt in linguistics and try to understand linguistic differences is really a fascinating concept to try to pull that together. So if we can stop here and entertain any questions or comments or anything like that. And I don't want to hold people too late. I kind of ran later than I thought I would here in my planning.
Remember that you can unmute yourself. And if you have trouble, you can send me a quick chat and I will assist you.
Well, Gil, thanks for the references to the Axtell book. That's one that I hadn't read by him, The European and the Indian, but I've read several of his other books, The Conflict Within, and and I think he's good value. Also, The Rabbit-Proof Fence, the film dealing with Aboriginal people in Australia. Yeah, that's, I think that's very good. Saw that when it came out, I don't know, about 20 years ago. And yeah, that's very good value. So I'm glad to know about that.
There also was a fairly recent movie called Australia that touched on a lot of these subjects.
Oh, called Australia?
Australia. It was a big epic. It had 2 Australian stars in it. She's married to a Keith Urban. I can't remember her name.
Nicole Kidman.
Nicole Kidman.
Oh.
It was a very long movie. It was very, I liked it a lot. But it spoke exactly to this.
That's a book or a film?
Well, it's a film.
Okay.
It may be a book too. I don't know.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, that's a good insight.
Yeah, I'll have to dig that out. Having lived in New Zealand and gone back there recently, I've never lived in Australia. I've spent much time there, but the tale of the Aboriginal people and particularly the tragedy of the Tasmanians is awful.
Right. Good point. And the Maoris in New Zealand.
The Maoris in New Zealand did better, certainly, than the Aboriginal people in Australia. They, for a number of long drawn out historical reasons. Yeah, they have they and the Pacific Island immigrants to New Zealand that have come in significant numbers in the last 60, 70 years. They've had a good deal of difficulty. The rural Maoris have tended to do a bit better. There's an interesting contemporary film, okay, it's 20 odd years old, Once Were Warriors, about urban Maori gangs in Auckland. And Once Were Warrior, again, very depressing, but I think a good film. And of course, that's that's a problem with many of the Native American tribes and people like the Maori, who were very effective warriors. And it's difficult to be warriors without weapons, as a early anthropological study of the Sioux people was titled.
Do you have the author of that?
Of Warriors Without Weapons?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, not off the top of my head.
Okay, I'll look it up.
Yeah, it was early on. It was one of the byproducts of the Indian New Deal in the 30s.
Uh-huh.
The new Commissioner of Indian Affairs began hiring anthropologists and asking them to do studies of tribal people. And the guy, and I cannot think of his name.
Was it Collier?
Well, Collier was the Commissioner of Indian Affairs.
Yeah.
Yeah, so this guy was hired by Collier's administration in the 30s, but maybe you can.
Kroeber did a lot of that kind of work.
Yeah. Pardon?
Kroeber?
Yeah.
The anthropologist Kroeber?
Yes, Kroeber did. And his daughter wrote some great fantasy, Ursula Kroeber Le Guin. Kroeber himself, working out of California.
Yeah.
Yeah, and as I'm sure you know, the California Native people had it worse than any other group in North America, so far as I know.
Yeah, 40,000 were slaughtered by the 49ers.
Yeah.
Those are estimated, but still, it's tragic no matter what number.
Yeah, particularly considering their peaceful and small-scale organization.
Yeah.
They were no threat.
Yeah. Well, very good. Any other comments or questions or? Well, I want to thank each and every one of you for attending. And I'm finding this is really interesting, working on the, with Zoom, this technology, and I'm enjoying seeing your faces. I haven't seen it otherwise, as a person for so long, but I really appreciate being able to do this and sharing with you and so on.
Yeah.
Both hard topics to deal with and also more pleasant ones to deal with. So, but I want to thank each and every one of you. And once again, I want to thank Lori for her expertise in this technology.
Well, I want to thank all of you for being brave enough to be guinea pigs with us while we have pursued this. I am very pleased with how things have gone so far this quarter, and it's so nice to be able to see you all and for us to be able to get together, even though it's not in person.
Yes, it really is. It's really good to see everybody.
See you all next week.
Yeah. Okay.
All right.
Thank
Have
you,
a great
Lori.
day, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.